Hey, GBS, we flipped F. Hey, GBS, if y'all could put your emails in the chat for the email chain, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, the AF should have been sent to everybody. Let me know if you didn't get it. Okay, cool. Is there anybody that didn't receive it / is not ready to start? Okay.
Danielle, give me 1 second. I gotta read something.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot about that.
Okay, is anybody who's like participating / judging not here? Okay, it looks like everyone is here, so. Okay, perfect. Welcome to the Sandra Worthington Silvers tutorial. I'm Shreyas Rajagopal, a first-year Woodruff Debate Scholar at Emory University. The participants in this debate are the Liberal Arts and Science Academy representing the affirmative. The first affirmative is Danielle Gu. The second affirmative is Ian Poe. And Glenbrook South representing the negative. The first negative is Griffin Jacobs. The second negative is Ian Majid. The evaluators of this debate are Ali Chase, Kevin Hearn, and Greg Soda.
I guess they revoked our professorships.
Oh no, sorry. Let me read. I forgot to read that part. Hold on. The evaluators to this debate are professors Ali Chase, Kevin Hearn, and Greg Soda. My mistake.
Thank you.
Now, is anybody not ready or hasn't received what I see? Great. Criminal justice is affected manages no longer just about the social location of the police, but the production of localized atmospheres and control that crystallize dominant understandings of space and belong that sensory stimulate all participants in body experiences that are protected the atmosphere of violence. Rule 19. A policing creates an atmosphere the space of the off from the formation of the police body is documented about charges the east against the atmosphere element of chanting the shouting the rhythm of unique issues can ask the robot on the police establishments together to steal the police and rally to sense of themselves. The term means such as the radiant outwards by attention to the police supposed to make the crowd feel for the action of the police and run a practical way. We think of the dread that person reveal the attention passing through those around them to wait for something to happen. The vibration reaches the presence. Her body changes the sense of method. The response of one person early beginning as different responses are communicated between the bodies at the heart of the generation after the feedback loop. The police officer seeks to control the demeanor, the projection, control the ambience of the communication. The affective considerations offered in public or tax information, bachelors of document horses, tear gas and vehicle, Chinese affective management present, and the clothing hats, gloves and shields, vehicles and grenades, and other technologies. And In atmospheres, we find zones of affect becoming constantly producing fields constructed through the elements that we constitute that which blurrily overlap between subject and object and inform the understanding of the self-subjectivity and interrelationality of space. Body 15. Atmosphere is a way of tracing the transmission of affect. Atmosphere to capture the emotional life of the place as well. Things are potentially inactable that place. Atmosphere is affect becoming. The atmosphere conveys something that is here, something's happening, even something's not always seen. The very aggregated affect in atmosphere is that subject and object tables is reflected affect experience alongside the formation of subjectivity atmospheres and to the movements that affect atmospheres on the internal external pressures affect and are affected the atmosphere the input and induced charges rather than change because the natural human world are but the effect must be played at the head center of social and cultural inequality. And atmospheric affect management isn't just about controlling emotion within space. It serves as a backdrop for the very understanding what space is and who should inhabit it, which enables the carcerality map of zones of belonging and exclusion. This spatialized by the state enables the demarcation of stages of livability and abjection fraction of Matthews 19. Drawing an atmosphere name with the pressure measure of race reaching the action human and non-human LASA. The notion of atmosphere reaches the affect to the street field by focusing on the street net of physical affect in this space. We can see that the atmosphere is a street constituted by the structural and cultural location, the ratio and ability to street lights, the passing of cars, pedestrians, the tillers, the motion groups, the sounds, the smell of the lights, and warnings. Each social field produces the street in order to put the numbers of the street by first the path, the demarcate and sustain the different social lights, relations to the height of the land appropriation authority to distribute in order to space the law giving community product and material practices appropriate and divide space and sensory governance and urban security stress needs to engage with the affective dimension of criminal justice. And carcerality, spatial boarding is a security bracket. It relies on constant reconstruction of the others, the threat to be preemptively eliminated. This cyclical investment in the abandonment shores up the hegemonic values of the carceral state while instilling a state of never-ending precarity. Yarwood 15. Security implies a contingent way of being either which always reliable to negation by new threats of hierarchy assumptions that many security practices anything with potential threat. Security focuses on the creation of literal medical barriers, seeking out people at the ideas and things that secret into the end of space. These practices love to exclude society that aims to exclude this regardless of threatening. While some may be allowed through barriers, others will be banished. The security practices to use space in integral ways with behavior threatening hegemonic and national values. The definition communicated and enforced a particular boundary spaces the ways of security and power. Security power contribute to a form of stratified mobility which grants access to spaces for some but at the same time to others. Security agents operate following a binary logic of securing their territory. They fail to appreciate the process that lead to people being vulnerable, show little concern where they move with their banished, pushing people out of one space into a place into another is not part of the solution. And this absolute control of spatiality becomes geopolicing rather than looking at behavior deemed criminal. The function of policing because the maintenance of spatial barriers against risky folks that enables not just the exclusion of certain ways of being deemed unproductive, but the consolidation of dominant paradigms and control that underpin racialized violence. Psychoia 20. Rather than looking for police look at members of martially groups are in and out of the proper ways to differentiate be understood as geopolicing aimed at governing the ability of police or so for hardening space of reinforce of boundaries and distinction the fortification of place. The geographical consistent meaning six bodies of firm protections so they do not work they abolish space race gender class mutual construction the geographies are ever changing stages protagonists that pass through as police they serve as interpretive ranks and co-subjects. They don't sense about their space and relational produce a continuum of risky bodies and meanings of representation of forged world and second bodies by police officers, by police into relation of geographies, landscapes, marginalized, geopolicing includes athletic recording and cleansing matter, urban matter of waste and fuel, spatial fragmentation, limiting the mobility, autonomy, and agent, urgency, creating social distance between the different categories of citizens. And spatial consolidation is part and parcel of racial atmospheres. The violence finds its focus not in the corporality of the individual, but the obliteration of certain forms existing where atmospheres are imbued with a cloudy layer of racial meaning. But atmospheres are never static. Their function is dynamic size of constant change to assert that the atmosphere architectures are a domination merely shift their form of expression rather than their underlying project. Yet this very mutability creates a possibility for moments of interruption. Body 15. The mutability of racism that is evident in the expressive biology culture that oversimple racism, the purported biology, it becomes a culture. It's racism that has to change the experience of racism, biology changing and taking unfamiliar approach shifts to the object of racism, no longer the corporality of the individual, a certain form of resisting racism. It's a totally instructional force. It's not a quirk. It's produced through it and produces an entire architecture of domination, racism, obliterates and oppressive and colonized that persistent crushes cultural values, techniques, and ways of life. The racial atmosphere practices all elements of social life. Violence in the atmosphere is here, and then it bursts out. The racial atmosphere will be a dynamic set of constant change, however, maintains its durability. Atmosphere points to racism as simultaneously present and immutability. All the atmosphere that racial violence persists and its change qualities and forward, but touching is anti-colonialism. It might create from perception of race as something that adheres representationally to bodies its opponent that moves towards humans, non-humans, and things, and always becoming something else. We think of bodies not as entities represented, but as material forces that hold the capacity to be affected, the race produces information that are felt but not easily represented. The body might be a crucial space through which race and racism operate, but is the reciprocal exchange between bodies that matters. The racial difference and the reality of all the interactions. The racial atmosphere might be viewed as a field producing forces that draw humans, non-humans, and things together and generate conditions of life. Averaging to election Obama alleged claim that upon March is post-racial, yet one can recount numerous instances of increasing level of racial violence post-Obama in the U.S. and American involvement abroad. Yet averaging equality allowed race to be present absent appear receiving to receive no relevant thinking. Atmosphere racially loses one racial representation towards racial constellation and directs the attention to the way racial meanings are produced to affect regulations and coagulations. Bodies and object atmosphere is the spirit which material energy, beliefs, and attitudes appear and becoming everything is drawn to the racial atmosphere. All matters reduced to nothing escapes or is beyond it. With the racial atmosphere, one thing is certain, it is always mutating into something other than it is. And the advantages of architecture is a form of mobility against the spatial control of criminal justice. The creation of architectural spaces through built design opens up zones of mobility and incubation for resistance through camouflage and carcerality. The project is disruption of the carceral states, smooth spatial boarding. Better 19. Mobility structures determine the needs of the nation state. I articulate mobility's disruption of the state's colonial, racial, ethnic, politics of population control. A solidarity contribution needed by a transnational women group in Gaziantep. The kitchen made use of the self-defense workshop group through sessions gallery, and the space was created by revenue existing for the use and the design where a space were decided collectively. The space kitchen represents mobility, but its structural function. The space of solidarity, sharing, and sustaining the struggle. Women mobilized and organized workshops, coding activities of mobility, proposing and searching against the restrictive politics of the Turkish state. And the British peace on communism initiative for mobilizing villagers outside the rules preordained by the state, and a spatial proposition that took place when the selected places in the Bishan village and Bishan community served as a gallery, library, and education space focused on dialogue and collaboration with the villagers and reading groups, small exhibitions, research concerts, and preservation of local traditions and mobility advised the space for precarious bodies to determine their own relation to search architecture grounded in the mobility, create diffuse boundaries that disrupt orders or created overheard form resulting from the work and mobilize the direction that enable the state with which uncertainty that the state is equipped alternative architectural collectivity purpose actions and a certain way of life that the state control a movement. And architecture is always at risk of being a tool of violence, but insurgent architecture understands and reorient space against the dominant order rather than serving as a magnifier of violence. There are a chance to embrace the disruptive dimension of spatial schemes that provide other dimensions of political imagination rather than remaining complicit in cultural violence. Number 19, architecture has a capacity to materially enforce its social engagement bodies, either side of lines of post strategies and movement or grant spatial access to some and refuses to others can be perceived as a fundamentally violent. What makes violence political is the agenda enforced through architecture. Certain architectures that understand this violence reorient against the dominant order. Architectures attempt to exist in the various contingencies daily resistance. We can focus on architects that we have not given on society how to say rather opting for the illusion of non-violence has decided to embrace the disruptive dimension through spatial schemes. Our hope is that architects that not only refuse to be complicit with programs but also organize against it, promoting another possible dimension of political imagination, modification of architectural conditions, and organizing work. Do you want me to read anything else, Ian?
No, we're good.
Okay, I'm good for cross-sex, whatever you are.
Okay. Cool. What's the role of the negative?
You can say that our method is bad.
Your method is bad. Like, what are we both attempting to solve? Like, is it just competing, like a method debate? Like, we both have plan, whoever's the competing bet.
The role of
Best
the
method.
negatives to disprove that the AF is a good idea.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what an ethical form of negation looks like. If it's not T.
For example, you could say our theory of atmospheres is incorrect. That'd be responsive to the AF. You could say insurgent architectures are bad. Those are two examples of things that would respond.
Okay. I'm confused. How does the AFs? So you've pointed to like specific instances that are bad, like housing discrimination. I'm wondering, how does the affirmative pedagogy disrupt those?
Well, we think that insurgent architectures are able to outline resolve some of the problems with atmospheres that we've outlined now. The Badir piece of evidence talks about several good examples. For example, the kitchen in Gaziantep, which is enables the community to come together and repurpose previously architectural spaces that were used for violence into better things as like sites for organizing.
How do the ballot change what architects think outside of the round?
Well, I don't think it like changes when an architect thinks. If you
Our
think
our argument isn't that there's a one-to-one correlation necessarily between what we say right here and everything we do in physical space, but we think that the AF's educational project is still good, i.e. debating about the intricacies of insurgent architecture and stuff is a way to teach us skills of how to do insurgent architecture and stuff like that, teach us about the atmospheric corporeality of criminal justice and stuff like that.
Okay. Let's say I grant you solvency, even though you don't solve. The end point of your politics, does it include getting rid of prisons?
Ian?
Yeah, the whole point of insurgent architectures is the repurposement of spaces, i.e. Spaces that work against us can be repurposed towards us. For example, actual architectural spaces can, instead of being a zone for violence, can be repurposed into a zone for things like livability for houseless people and stuff like that.
Are there
We think that
police?
the AF's process...
Telos AF, is there police?
The AF doesn't say that we would get rid of police immediately. We have a kind of method of spatialization.
I'm wondering,
architecture.
after everyone has enacted your book club and we all like think like architects, do police like still exist? I'm talking about Telos.
The AF has made an argument about how creating spaces. I don't know if we have to answer that question really, because we've said that these dominant forces are always going to try to hurt us, and we should create spaces of resistance against those dominant forces for survivability and resistance, and like organization to them.
Why is
where are those spaces of resistance?
They're
Like,
in architectural spaces that already exist. The entire app is about
How do you create those architectural spaces? Like, are y'all builders?
We're not creating it. The spaces already exist. The question is whether.
Then why is the AF necessary?
The question is the purpose we use them for, i.e. the entire app was about why we need to repurpose those spaces to become insurgent architecture.
Makes negative sense. Griffin, do you want prep?
No, I'm good. I'm sending. It's 3, then case. Let me know when everyone has it, and he's good to start. Actually, I'm gonna go turn on my lights real quick. That's better. Everyone good?
Wait a second for me to download it.
Okay.
I'm good.
Okay. Someone give some kind of verbal indication if you're not. Otherwise, I'm going to start in like 5 seconds. Cool. First off, is topicality. The USFC is the United States federal government of Washington, D.C. The dictionary of government politics 98 enactment means to make it a law. Black law dictionary and reforms about policy changes, choice of what the government will do. This is 193 forensic sciences, evidence analysis, TOJ, 19 forensic science, analyze and evidence, forensic science, analyze and evidence, do assist in investigation and prosecution of perpetrators. Policing is the activities carried out by police officers. Calling and desentencing is the process of punishing someone upon finding their guilt. NCVLI 12 upon finding guilt through a plea or a trial. The formal position of punishment code that excludes prison reform. That's surrounded with teen sentencing reform targets reducing the amount of people, the amount of time people spend in prison. Reform means reducing the time once people are already incarcerated. Violation. The act either doesn't defend the resolution or the extra topical voter for limiting ground justifies if an unpredictable advantage ground which overstretches negative research report spike on a court generics impact is fairness manipulating the ballot to structure socially favors the app. People come to debate for different reasons, but the student of the ballot is the only unifying characteristic. Clash, unpredictability, destroys research accessibility, and nuance, refinement, empathy, and value clarification, or key-defined dogma, and create better advocates. It turns case because precluding testing means the app should be considered presumptively false. Any test to the TBA or negative ground is the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform by ending forensic science, policing, and sentencing. That's Jacobs 20. Then no impact turns if a prior resolutional question of procedural cases bring into the question of situation have happened in the first place, and reading them negative and switch sides all vote negative for deterrence. Worst agree with you, I vote negative because we shouldn't be during debate, not specifying our actor and or method is a voting issue. Decimates core negative ground, nuance method, new and method debates. Causes too late for the 1SG strat. Next off. We endorse the entirety of the AF minus the metaphorical uses of the term mobility outlined in their Badir evidence. Their use of ableist metaphors of mobility recenters a rhetorical flame that devalues the lived experience of people with disabilities and reduces them to rhetorical objects. This reinscribes exclusionary ableist paradigms that turn the liberatory potential of the AF. That's May and Ferry 6. In questioning ableist analogies, our goal is not to find the perfect metaphor. We're not advocating for the policing of language boundaries. Core problems is that most analogies of disability are often limitedly carelessly and overly fixed disabilities are really conceptualized as a constructed outcome of power, nor regarded as a political identity forged and through systems of domination. The presumed status of disability remains unchallenged because it only answers discourse and its metaphoric sense does not comprehend as a live reality, nor is an analytic counter dust disability has been interpreted as entirely a bodily and or medical state of deficiency. The use of ableist metaphors and discourse aimed at critiquing or transforming the status quo. We question the use of ableist notions of mobility in the movement to find and imagine liberation, resistance, transformation. All these rhetorical uses of disability reinscribe normative and exclusionary paradigms within otherwise liberatory theories. Normative theories of disability highlight the need for new metaphors and frames of reference to theorize multiplicity and fully realize social transformation. Transforming the ways that we use language will help develop more intersectional analysis and political coalitions that do not originate in exclusionary subject-object dualism. And the 1AC's critical resistance is one that attempts to carve out space to survive within capitalism, which trades off. That's next off. The 1AC's critical resistance is one that is to carve out space and survive within capitalism, which trades off with demands for change at a structural level. The AS analysis of space is made possible by the organization of labor and property under capitalism. Absent rallying around universal demands for communists organizing the 1AC's resistance to spatial ordering will fail. That's Cody, Sir Nick, and William 16. The left continues to rely on outmoded tactics of fighting defensively rather than imagining a new future. Left co-opt existing socio-technical tendencies within capitalism in order to accelerate its demise into a more equitable system. If we want to transform the political fabric, we need to be placing issues of skill into the forefront of our strategic analysis. By neglecting this today, politics often remains bound to marginal gestures that can content to build a temporary space of respite from the world, unable to change broader structures on their own. They tend to be inadequate to deal with large-scale structural hegemonic phenomena like globalized capitalism. Architecture could be described as undergoing a social turn with a new emphasis on local political situation. While a lot of the projects are designed to improve the lives of some users, some wonder if they fail to address the largest systemic conditions producing housing crisis and wash over these structures by implicitly positing volunteerism. Adequate replacement from the welfare state architecture is inherently political. We need only to look at the housing bubble, the 2006 relationship inequalities to see this. The architecture if architects ignore their role in this process, they are accepting implicit and full automation as universal basic income can and should become oriented to innovate for a left-hand project capable of challenging capitals and full automation requires offers a chance to transform nearly every industry. Architecture is no exception of progressive decrease into the amount of work we have to do for a boss and subsequent expansion of our abilities to do self-directed work and more education, care for families, and of course creative work. The will to secure civil societies against the crisis of financial state is parasitical on black exploitation, death, racial capitalism requires predatory lending, financial states of exception, automated processing, extracting confinement, and gratuitous violence. It's weighing. 18. Surplus population or housing generate value in prisoners that die, reconfigures the political poverty, civic kind of subject to reduce the lives of accreditation, reduce our land market skills that make it impossible to explore one or create form of instrumentalized social without revolutionary knowledge to turn back predatory lending and parasitic government links to devise the emergency of all crises hurls that exist stake working tandem with global capitalism, parasitic governance, modality, racial capitalism, financial states, automated processing, destruction, looting, confinement, and gratuitous violence. And in the case of when these matters directly determine the quality of life and how government bodies implement software that automates the process of extraction, whether it's conveyed by one person never sees to take it has a war down to racialized appropriation of life, including other life, political capitalism, government sees criminal justice, no blue, black, tradition, the aspect of capitalism, necessary forces to expropriate wealth from outside forms of regime, class, and spatial segregation, poverty, superiority, ghettoization, racial segregation, the spatial concentration of poverty, essentially here, social market, loot, financialization, automated proceed by a while, process of confinement, aggressive results, significant actual death, anti-black racism, the core massacres, not only the neoliberal density, but in people see poverty to do more, even have the destruction of black Americans, such as massacres, the alternative is to reject the app in favor of material analysis, torture, revolution. Our form of study builds a party based on the scientific formulation of Mao's principles to catalyze a mass base against capitalism and white supremacist Williams. 18. Mao's not everything about it. Mao's a with the universe that we apply to all of material interest revolution. Websites is historical content be used short like a scientific method of analysis, political education, debates inside the party, and a cultural living and with commerce ready. Commerce open the door for the FBI must study because one who develop another organization, they'll converse again. The party will requires the cultivation of a base people must participate in the organization before alcohol, subject to squabbling, set the federal mass base must end this best over the new African Mao system. Mao's more beneficial think about how it can be applied to we may see united principle based on resistance to capital white supremacy. Go to case. Vote negative on presumption. There's no relationship between voting AF and their advocacy or solvency, poor order, atmospheric management. I mean, it's cruelly optimistic to think that voting AF does anything in governance is inevitable in turns cases. True. No. 19. Human nature are political churches next with the material consciousness states on separate from society. This society, the inevitable necessary product of historical development without a society reduced to ubiquitous connected violence to decline slowly for all and degradation in the quality of goods and the quality of goods humans or anything but uniform without the state contradiction will be acted out through physical structure. Two outcomes either state will be formed new after a period of crisis dealing devastating damage to all our construction fields and the population collapse of regulation of violence only the only rational expression of political interest, class dictatorship, the lesson of the Paris Commune, all revolutionary virtues that revolution is not state power, sort of communist, not fear, but relish the opportunity and control and state working class united. It must create a state service own must be socialism or extinction. Falsifiability should be a filter for the entirety of the management debate. Their theory is untestable, should be presumptively false, or its only value rests in enabling an understanding of the world and the subsequent actions as a result of that understanding. Materiality precedes atmospheric management, even if they win that true materiality figures how that management operates in the real world. They agree that geopolicing can get worse and reducing harm is still intrinsically good. They can only verify it with examples, meaning that one example should disprove their thesis. Appeals to affect or a theoretical cop-out to avoid examining the concrete empirical nature of politics and communication. That's Grossberg 10. I think of a nice way of putting it, affect and let you off the hook. It comes to serve it not too often as a magical term, non-representational. Then we can just describe it as affect, analyzing the articulation between the ontological and the empirical. I see nothing particularly political about it anyway. That does not mean the description of any empirical reality. There is a difference between the transcendental condition of possibility and the actualization of these. It often ends up producing a radically deterritorializing politics and too much work done by people who talk about affects, mischievous reason work reduplicates a kind of old-fashioned media effects model. I don't think we've yet done the actual work parsing out everything that is collapsing into the general notion of affect. Affect, that's what we now call affect. We don't end up having to define that specificity. Affect is just a question of socialization. Our theory is compatible with Martin 13. Scholars claim reason and rationality has been overvalued. They opt the vision that humans are corporeal. The affective resonance is produced, shown in detail. Psychological evidence for the basis of affect is questionable and outdated. Misread biological and psychological research evidence of a gamma reflections of the fact that sometimes a mental event might precede that action, but in any case, the interior event could not constitute a usable criterion for whether or not someone was intending to whistle or removing any interest into intentionality. Removes socially produced context of use. Affects are social effect rather than a result of human biology.
Okay. You good for Cosix?
Yes.
Oh, wait, give me 1 second. I set my timer too hard. Cool. T, what's the difference in ground for the negative between sentencing and prison reform?
Between sentencing and prison reform, prisons are an entirely different topic than sentencing and policing.
Can you just give me examples of ground that would be different for the negative?
Of different prison reform apps?
Court processes, we would lose.
Of how it would be different. There are also specific disads to sentencing procedures that result that are about how courts do sentencing and how policing is carried out. A
Our,
sentence.
our
Okay,
main
yeah,
argument about this will be that arbitrarily adding another area to the resolution justifies adding an infinite number of areas, explodes
Okay,
limits. That's bad.
Sure. The TVA, what grounds could you have read to the TVA that you could not read against the AF?
The court's counterplan, federalism, politics
Why are
dissents, the
those debates
executive
important?
counterplan, because we think engaging the state is good and necessary to solve your AF.
Okay.
If those things link, the TVA was the
the-
F all along, then you should have read the TVA.
The K. What does the alternative do about architecture and space?
The bottom of the card talks about that. We think that the affirmative has no way. The bottom of the link card it talks about that. The affirmative has no way to actually change architects, and it talks about how architecture.
I understand that you think that. I want to know what the alternative does about it.
Oh, we see state power and then the state controls architecture.
Okay. Who can join the party?
Anyone who
Anyone
meets the
we screen
requirements of the
them.
party line.
What are those requirements?
There's a
That's
lot
what we
of
think debate
things.
is about. But
The
yeah, give us
primarily
some
it's a
examples.
presupposition against capitalism and white supremacy, environmentalism being good, things
The
like
the first card, why is our analysis of space inherently capitalist? I'm
that.
confused.
It's the wrong starting point. We'll make a sequencing dissent to the affirmative, i.e., the policing of space is just a material consequence of racial capitalism. You misdiagnose the problem and have the wrong starting point. That
Okay.
means racial
Why does
capitalism
that
is all
trade?
cause.
Yeah, why does that trade off with those structural demands?
Sanitizing and re-legitimizing capitalism, which is bad.
We can make two arguments. One is about that people.
No, but you were like the one I see's method trades off with structural change.
Yeah, we can make two
Yes.
arguments. First, one is about state engagement. We think it's necessarily key to solving the AF. The second one we'll make is about time investment, and people investing in certain movements necessarily has a zero-sum relationship with investing in different movements.
Okay, sure. So the presumption stuff, you were like, there's no relationship between voting and their advocacies or solvency. Does voting negative enact the alternative?
Yeah, the Williams piece of evidence is actually about why debate is necessarily key to our advocacy and building a mass
we
base.
we talk about the alternative in debate. What's the internal link to spill up?
It's not about talking about the alternative. It's about forming a mass base within the debate by theorizing and debating about which communist tactics would be best.
8 minutes start. Stop at 7:25. Let me send it out. While I'm sending it, order is going to be the case page, the pick, the framework page, and then the K. And I'm sending it right now. And my Wi-Fi is a little bit slow, but let me know when y'all have received it.
I'm still waiting for it, but I'm gonna pee in the interim if that's fine.
Okay, sure. No one else has got it, right? My Wi-Fi might just be a little slow.
Yeah, I'm still waiting.
anyone got it yet?
I got it.
Okay, cool.
Just load through.
GBS, you're all both good? Cool. If anyone's not good, stop me in the next like 10 seconds. Okay. Criminal justice is carceral space, making the built atmospheres of the system inform both affective relations and understanding of space and who belongs in, which results in a cycle of reactive securitization to push the other to zones of unlivability. It's part of a cycle of racial atmospheres where this cloud of violence informed by our environment doesn't go away, only mutates, resulting in the obliteration of oppressed ways of being. Since a white monopoly on violence, the one AC affirms in such architectures, both repurposing and rebuilding of architectural spaces and active mobility against the state's population control enables disorderly bodies to self-determine their own relationships. It's a space for both survival and incubation of broader resistance movements through its evasion of carceral normative gateways, ruptures dominant atmospheres of such spatial control. They say presumption of voting half endorses foreign interests in such architecture, not even our activism will definitively be good if they happen more. They have to prove it's bad, but it's also a process, not a moment. The reduction of the app to quote no endpoint misunderstands how continuous challenges are key, even if they happen before. Double standards, expecting candidates to perform advocacy and the proofs full of when policy knows when is intellectual something, but our apps useful to inform external action. We'll make prior arguments about this on framework. Their government inevitable argument, kind of the point of the app. The state's always going to try to do violent stuff against us, but we can create spaces to resist that through such architecture that can hide from the state, which was the Badir evidence. Also, eternal solvency to visit decay, because it means they can never wish away the state. They say non-falsifiable. It is a ridiculous standard. What does it mean for something to be falsifiable? There's no test for that, but here's a study anyway. That's ruled 18. Many making is a product of constant activity between all these sources of primal material artifacts and disposal constantly meaning every moment of all the atmosphere actually materially, but opposite of qualities if you animated the director is the light conforms they subject qualities of company expense information offered is all the interest of actors and the experience but the habits are the movements of the body of the person atmosphere in your web using their subjective feeling and shed in a way they were included on leisure boss resulting in facial qualities meaning has been commonly used as possible this is how the appealing meaning in the dark of the language is the other atmospheres and we describe the individual aspects of the creation of the mind that's from the intersubjectivity mark the card intersubjectivity and materiality first up, then give a counter example if you have one, but this is kind of our argument. Atmospheres are the combination of both space and affect into one and how that affects us. We didn't say it's just about the way we think, but also about the way that spaces inform us. The struggle system stuff, we're not acceptance. The F is a prerequisite to organization against stuff like capitals. We think that's key since anything else gets crushed by the state, but we can create zones where the state can't find us anymore. The pick. At the top of the pick, permutation do both probably resolves, but permutation do in such architecture is a way to counter ableism. It's a combination of our theories that works better. They're focused on linguistic determinism, abstracts away from the actual lived conditions of ableism because they assume that it only occurs on the discursive plane when it's about actual things like physicality of space. But the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which is the reason why picks are bad. The whole point of atmospheres is that we can't reduce it down to any one element, which means that their pick and choose model of singling out pieces of the app doesn't actually solve the discursive production of the app. The Badir card doesn't use mobility as a concept in terms of actual movement within space necessarily. It says that it's a concept of how we exist within space, and it's a concept to define the way that the government tries to spatially border us. It's not actually people need to be physically mobile. It's not the argument that we've made, but their theory is also pretty homogenizing. It assumes a universal frame of disabled folks who are unable to move, i.e. it assumes that disabled folks are never able to move, which causes things like crowded of other disabled folks, like people who can move or have mental disabilities, because they only assume a specific frame of ableism, which replicates all the violence they say. But picks are of order one. If they win a fairness argument, it still is the majority of the app decide to impact on one particular part, which is infinitely aggressive into taglines, unhighlighted words in the cards, etc. Forces to reset offense in the tways. A second education prevents a discussion of what the app does by narrowing focus to one arbitrary disagreement, creates shallow debates. There, one if you have a card on your side, interpretation, they can impact on any part of the one you see. Don't get a pick out of it. It gives them sufficient ground. It's also bad for practice because it's the exact purity politics of the left, which means that we pick and choose parts of other movements so we can never actually spill up to anything. Framework. At the top, security. DA framework is as a reactionary response to chaos, which was seen to threaten this space, produces security participants that exclude behavior threatening to hegemonic imagined values. So their definition, communication, and enforcement of purely abided space. So their interrupt is an inaccurate post-factor derivative on debate that excludes folks who are already a part of it to create a state of constant precarity. That's Yarwood's second architecture. G. Imagine yourselves a feudal architects of a new criminal justice system, cycling agreements with the redeemability of that space. That's Lambert 16. We 11 studies relying across all studies to first line of behavior, just legal and social accountability, design across all conditions, consider how it's creative publicity with relation to the argument making presence more human and with regards to deep in the assurance that making more legitimate that ever promise consider strong systemic criminalization and violence and improvement to legitimize the carceral scheme architecture, social opportunity, carceral architecture in the case of carceral environments when we need to go when their first realize the resume is strength, their less from carceration. Self-racial atmospheres, D reforms on a useful project, the way for racial to change its experience through the mutability of racial atmospheres and shows violence under reformism doesn't go away to shift, believing that advocacy is a form of cruel optimism to something will change means they think we've surpassed race, which allows racial violence to find new pervasive forms. The app utilizes moments of interruption. That's Mawani, subject formation first debates, not just the 90 minutes before the RFT. They ignore their community university participants, they make it not just a game. Proof by Zoom debates is worse, even though the quote unquote game's the same. Debates and atmosphere that changes how we approach the rule means debaters internalize arguments. That's Mawani counter counter-interp the action definitive method for substantially disrupting the criminal justice system in the United States. They still get granted by the object of the resolution. That counter-interp corrects the top-down approach to nationalization of criminal justice. That's key to education. That's young 19. I'm so essential working on evolution of criminal justice, environmental, family, normalized relations to the same elements within criminal environments and products, the values and bodies, the designing criminal justice, spatial suicide, crucial president who shows he will be rupture, can be ever someone's on this criminal justice, which always seek affirmation of authority. I'm sure I be to understand that Mr. Works, you will understand the MCU's the sugar for which I would say the emerged as understanding the power criminal justice environments, the choreographed for spatial fighter and studying MCU's directions towards a potential in the landscape social once we can be all the components of atmospheres of criminal justice weak becomes possible understand their both arbitration and plausible interpretations of justice as we describe the no. They say limits counter-interp solves constrained amount of debates, but functional limits check bad apps don't win and get checked by degenerate. Running to the margins is inevitable in policy debate because people with stuff like Coast Guards, Guantanamo, or Cloud anyway. They say they say Grand covered the Cap K abolition of their movements. They read the Cap K proves they had it. They say fairness, it's circular. They said fairness good because the space should be fair. Designing for the sake of design is bad. Ignore the reason why we're here, which it's also self-correcting. Also, it's found by structural inequalities. They say clash inevitable. Nobody says nothing but they're clashes because it's just process deep clash, which are bad debates. We've impacted that anyway. The TVA doesn't solve our reform-based offense. We've also made an argument about how the reformism only reallocates fund, doesn't actually solve anything. Extra T, no ground loss means it doesn't really matter. We've made an argument that Carson exceeded the 3 topic areas, which means that addressing it as any one of those areas doesn't make sense. They say aspect we prefer a method of insurgent architecture. Doesn't have to say who does it or but our cards give examples. They could have disproven those examples if they wanted to answer it. Okay. At the top of the K, they definitely perf cons with the framework stuff because it says that state is bad, whereas framework says the state can be used for good things, but they don't have to define a praxis to achieve their all. Just running the all without discussing how we get there is unrealistic and utopian. It means we can never figure out the specific work we got to do for resistance to be successful, which confines us to passivity and uneducational. Capitalist control is about the modulation of space. Only our intervention on space is key. That's link 17. Friction defined by Marx concerns space housing, equipment, and transportation, artists, or MCs, the capitalist and the real space, well, modifying the political artists, the full future information, ownership rights, system, no stability, and account reduction is relations based on leverage relative planning and the state developed through ways that understand communication networks, class warfare, worker buses, and outdated the global added value, redistribution, the understood element, and exploitation, tricks up production of space and inspires to to concrete actions. Mark the card at concrete actions. Their first card, no reason why we said that we're a prerequisite to this system. It's not just carving out spaces and being in those spaces forever. We think it's a prerequisite to it working, which definitely means that permutation do both. We must begin our revolution at the level of spatial praxis. I think they're the necessary forms for organization. That's Swinge do 15. Neither this nor the party are useful comments about this. At least call from the beginning in terms of thinking through what social forms are required. All scale and what forms of the organization are where the little volumes become joined by with the social subjectivities, communism, manifestation, super self-organization from what we consider open organization from the place that you think to the comments about it. Actually, when you for the 21st century, politics will have to take that time and form of coming short with the limit which all should be greater president of things. They haven't really read a link to the F, but the second card, the Wayne card, definitely proves that we're right because we can combine a theory of racialization and capitalism under one, which is a better way to approach the world. The alternative definitely doesn't do anything. It's just thinking about the world differently, which never spills up into materialism. If it is materialism, it definitely proves the perm solves best because we think that materialism is key. But there's a valorization. The alignment with the party has a cost: labor, militarization, and revolutionary terror, which also ensures there's a co-option DA because people will infiltrate the party. They'll let in people who they don't know are bad, like white supremacists who are still proletariats, which ensures it gets co-opted and never goes anywhere. The architecture is a possibility for using new spaces against capitalism, even as at L16. The architect created and discover new policies, and architects has to think about how to serve this power relation, how can use technology at disposal to achieve goals that are alternative to capitalist goals, like in the power of capitalism, the condition of the built environments, features of need the architects to be more for traditional design, can provide changes opposition to the landscape of urbanization. Mark the card at urbanization. That was the Ibanez et al. Card.
All right. Good for cross-lex?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's start with the perf con on cap. When did we say the state was bad?
One, we think the Wayne card talks about racial capitalism. We think that capitalism intertwined with the state, attempting on framework to work through the state is probably just a way that kind of recreates those capitalist psychological
Can you
investments.
specify whether or not, like, what the affirmative stance on using the state is? Does the state exist in the world of the AF?
Well, the state does exist. Like,
yes.
Right now, we've made an argument that we can create kind of counter architectures to resist the technologies of the state that we think are violent.
Yeah, let's talk about counter
Like, our argument isn't that we just wish away the state.
We're talking about counter architectures. What empirical examples does the AF cite?
There's two in the Badir card that we talk about. One, there's this idea of this kitchen in Gaziantep, which is the repurposement of an old architectural space that worked against people into a new architectural space where new things were built so that they could do things like feed people, do sessions that could do things like self-defense and like emotional healing. We think that that's good. Also, the Bishan commune is an example in the same Badir card, which was a space in China that
Does that
created.
commune still exist today?
I think they disbanded.
Why?
Let's see. Am I saying the card?
That's fine. What is the relationship between the 1AC and these architectural spaces? I'm still confused about
I
this.
really don't know what you're trying to get with this question. Can you like rephrase?
What is the relationship between your speech act within debate and
we've
these
said that insurgent
architectural
architectures are
movements?
good.
You've just said that they're good,
Well, that's
even though
one
they
thing we've said, but
already
also,
exist and you don't contribute to them.
I have another answer to this if you let me say it. The card we read on Framework, the Young card, talks specifically about how analysis of these atmospheres and architectural strategies to resist them is a way to kind of spill up to resistance. It says that studying atmospheres directs us towards a potential fault line in the landscape of social control. We think that things like KVK debates and stuff over this app are a way to create and understand those fault lines of social control, which is a way that we can execute atmospheres.
Is there any reason that your speech act is uniquely key?
I mean, we've made, I think I kind of just explained that. The Young card talks about how it's important to talk about these things, and discussions about these things are a way to inform our activism and the way that we can approach the world atmospherically.
So our discussions form our perceptions of the world and the way that we act politically. They have material implications, correct?
We've made arguments that discussions can be important to the way we
yeah.
act. I mean, we've also made arguments about, it's not a yes or no question, and we've also made arguments about atmospherics and how those inform the way we think about the world. We think that both of these things are mutually co-constitutive.
All right, that's fine.
We have 8 starting now. at 4:45. I'm saving and sending it. While I'm doing that, is everybody good for an order? Is everyone here? I assume? Okay, we'll wait for Kahan.
Before you send it, I'm gonna go fill my water.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll send it first. Okay, now everyone's here. The order is going to be the pick, the case page, Maoism. I would flow straight down for everything. Everyone cool? I'm gonna start in 10 seconds. Someone stop me if they're not ready. Voting negative solves the entirety of the case of what's the benefit. The pick agrees with the cave atmospheric exposure. We're picking out of the metaphorization of mobility using their solid evidence. The video evidence. If we win a risk, the net benefit very negative. They must win an office justification for the use of the term mobility. That was that benefit. There's no solid deficit because the pick does the whole half minus the use of this benefit. They don't have any office justification for this metaphor is good or even deficits for what's not able as 2C1 framework. The one observations we should be able to have for finding an alternative method which keeps competes on a disagreement. The one I see without engaging that totality. Keep the debates over a small disagreement. Don't force negative disprove reason will also generate unique from education. That means you should select the alpha negative parallel tracks and all the options and tensions. 2AC2 framework proves that even if the alpha is the perm doesn't shield because the link for the way the alpha is incremental the alternative or the perm is ideological summons spike in a ground is an issue with fairness, argument, responsibility, and it because it magnified by a lack of stable advocacy and it's incoherent because it's a pick 2AC3 and 4. We only have to win a small list of the link because the pick solves the whole app. We have multiple links in front of mobility is a core part of the 1AC theory and affirmation that proves voting negatives opportunity cost of the research part of the 1AC. This is no part of the evidence. This is the entire these are the solvency advocate. Their card begins with the thesis is the cost of mobility regimes justification mobility for some global movements of people as well the expansion urbanization those deterministic ideas society needs to shape power and freedom to just the possibility of mobility is rational being matter of choice to separate another. Their card goes on to actively metaphorize the lived experience of disabled people for the purpose of establishing a theory when it says mobility is paradoxical differentiating the human condition rather than unifying bodily immobility might exist in the parallel to mobility of one's mind here of the two meanings that constantly taken and able to explain in their article first mobility opinion here disability appears nothing more than a rhetorical object that can be compared or constructed that can be restricted to the mobility of one's mind, which also relies on ableist notions of cognitive and bodily function that use lived experiences of disabled people as rhetorical fair. This always assures the case. The mere fair evidence from the 1 and 2 was conceded. It says that it reduces disabled people's rhetorical objects and invests in exclusionary paradigm that develops disabled people's living experience and the ability to not change the firms that do through movement fraction. When their author says, okay, I will agree with the mobility disrupts the nation states colonial racial identity identity political population control. They ignore that the metaphorization reinforces the dominant form of the nation state, only voting negative to refuse this active exclusion can solve the Trotsky. 10. The active notion exclusion of disabled people or presence of absent access are wasting goods. The source of these are interpretive acts that they bring away every day to conscious theoretically and change disability as well. Acts of vision political interpretive acts that bring associated organized forms of awareness as theorizing as a way of framing an issue are at a time this means frame arcade about Western white Western bureaucratic practice and associated inclusion and exclusion of disability framed by accurate directional that global reach is demonstrated the singular expression of disability but all the reasons radical embodiment that process that is for technically neutral disability. The instant that disability is the state release the framing of the structures that daily life and the history of preparation of the runs absence disability inclusion exclusion of university space that relation between body and social space numbers you have heard how disability remains associated with the plus presence of disability source that doing means the embodiment as a result of reductions and exclusion in a new more imaginary way narrative sort of represent the stable disability. How do we understand what it means to be subject considered relations to the university 2 and C5 linguistic determinism reps do matter control how the designs pull up justifications can affect or organize the laws more than acts themselves. I both represent David Duke what's funny there's a one because Andy Summers and the other holdings bad they're models that both the same outcomes opposite intentions means we analyze the epistemological coordinates of the 1AC is key to the ethical FC in the first place. That's also proven by the fact that pedagogy is the only way this develops. So we obviously going to pick out a part today as per the 1 and as per the 1C and be the debate below 2 and C6. It doesn't matter if the affirmative is going to abstract things magnified by no obvious reason. They couldn't use alternative analytics like transformation or transformation 2 to 8. There's no impact analysis between this argument or the rest of the pick. So even if they win it, also it's completely incoherent because we didn't prescribe a totalizing notion of what disability is or what it looks like. We just say that you endorse a certain form that is bad and exclusionary, and you've had no obvious reason why it's answered. So there's no way you could go for this argument. You've already lost 2 and C7 counter. We get picks in the test. The plan in the solvency against solves all the obvious excludes random more picks that only lets us parse the app and they have a certain outline as PowerPoints they have as picks are the best one in class. We should not be forced to disagree with each harder than when I see pick. The pick is not stealing or moving the app. It's a way of understanding competition. This is those large trusts the one I see that we agree with. We should not be forced to say that geopolitics and control speech are good. Our interpret is that those are the best nuanced class rather than negative to disagree with ask method or solvency advocate, which versus nuanced internet based on critical teams. Their interpret structure mirrors the app, especially in a world when they're not balanced with the resolution, which solves the intro problems above. They can use vagueness to the app and perms to know like everything. Picks force they have to be accountable for their plan and solvency advocate and a lot of the negative testing they've outlined is often to the one I see. That means that there's reciprocal. They should defend why they chose mobility as their solvency advocate. Our term has the message link to advocacy skills and argument responsibility that forces the app better writing because they're forced to win office things the one I see and go back to the drawing board. This is a K debate. We all agree. Verdict matters, so they have no answer to why substantive defensive testing rhetoric of the one I see discourse and material implications. We should have debates about those implications. Don't want to reasonability. They just have to win a rhetorical defense of their solvency advocate. If they win, picks are bad. Just about the case, not a pick. If they have to win that, we make it impossible. And if the win start method testing, they should be the counter advocacy to the one I see, which they've conceded is what the pick are. It's just a different way of doing the affirmative. They should be make solvency deficits while agreeing to the methods and key to show the harms of fronts are not conscious of the intentions, which often that way is the case page. Liberal arts and science academies run an ideological dumpster fire. Vote them down to presumption. First is the atmospheric management double bind. Either they're harm wrong about the world works, or if they're right, that space solution increased carcerality means our form fails. Makes cool optimistic that accumulates about some uniquely resolve their impact, or is necessary to solve. They have to prove this assessment issues. Their AFC and the AFSR said need the balance against no below the balance unique no unique impact of Lambert. Evidence is about architects design things like prison towers to help the streets to control people. First, no spillover, but they have changes the will of those architects to design space and the way they resist power. Second, proves the sequencing argument that we're extending on the cap pay that change the financial incentives can only resist spatial organization by dominating elites. Only that means that they're unable to solve and they just get co-opted by big corporations or partners that want the government to build panoptic buildings and they have no offensive reason how they're resistant and they just vaguely say we create hedge and countertops that resist with them and the only movements they cite get bodied. The mounting evidence does not make a reverse causal claim. At best they can create moments of resistance, but they have no offensive reason. We have to conclusively overcome carcerality, which warrants a presumption government refuses to address broader racialized causality is an alternative cause of death because they said that things like the police would still exist post-app, which is a deterrent to the app. Even if they do blow up, they fail. The one example they cited in cross-text got disbanded. The endpoint of their politics is anarchism, unchecked capitalism, manifesto, and unchecked white privacy violence, and massive decline living standards, unregulated emissions, and they have no way they can overcome this as the arguments of it, and there were no evidence to the one I see that drives people to reinstate their governance and lash out against the app, which is net worse, and the endpoint of their policy fails. False liability to be a filter for the atmosphere management. Their chairs untestable, no reasonable evidence to make anything otherwise. Even if they win the link is that sort of possible ontology, whether there's results of political, even if they win a link that their thing is still true, the only value of the statement as per their evidence is how it shapes their actions and political commitments, but they've dropped that affect is a bad standard, which is will lose them debate. First, is that it's an unverifiable analytic system match material and void political engagement. That's the gross evidence. Descriptions of having total line with pure reality. Affectives should be able to get them back for the hook and answer questions of materialistic problems to app strategy. Affect is built through sociality and mature interaction. Martin, that means that the way we speak in debate about things is something to be analyzed rather than vague theory of affect. It also bolsters the impact to the pick because it says the affect is created by social interaction and the language that makes bad affect. Go to the critique, concede the permutation. It was just against the competition. They can't advocate for it as a way to solve capitalism broadly because they've conceded these conditionality. But we looked at it as an alternative cost the app. First, the PerfCon argument. They didn't warrant out why PerfCon was bad, so you shouldn't allow them to blow this up in the 1 hour. Also, our argument was that there was no risk of PerfCon because the critique defended as per the word evidence, seizing state power and engaging the state. So there was no risk of this. The absence of the geopolicing is nothing more than a rhetorical strategy without a material blueprint for how to change the inner workings of power. Our evidence on the cap case says that private property and maintain class divisions explain the control of space through the geopolicing. The reason the cops exist in the first place to protect private property of the elite, absent concrete demands like full automation of free universal healthcare. The politics being seated to centers conservative events. If they do solve this, then it definitely magnifies that extra T link on T that Griffin will body them on in the 1 hour. I'm good.
Okay, we have 7:25. We'll start pro. I had 633. Let me put that in the chat.
I'm open.
Cool. You made an argument on case about kind of a backlash. What was it?
You told me in 1AC Cross-X that the AF doesn't get rid of police. They would just crush your movement when you try to do your architecture book club if it does do anything meaningful.
Okay,
could-
so
Say that this is true, proven by like the Black Panthers and basically any communist movement
Yeah,
that tries to
a
create
large point of
alternative
these
spaces.
movements specifically was kind of to also be visible publicly and to push for things like that. The whole point of the app is that it's hiding out from them. Why would they still crush it even though it's kind of the opposite paradigm?
Our argument is that when you do anything meaningful, then you do become visible. And if you do overcome the perception argument, then the police will come after you.
Also, we can say that this is empirically true given the one of the two examples that you gave in Cross-X, i.e. the
Okay, that's
Maoists
fine.
that got
The
disbanded
pick,
because
I've
the
got some
police
questions
cracked
kind of
down
about
on
your
them.
theory of power on the pick. What does the pick kind of analyze disability as? Disability as social construct? What is it?
Sure. We just think that it's bad. And the one he sees exclusionary.
Well, I'm kind of asking about the theory that your authors defend, i.e. Tishkovsky, what theory of what disability is does this defend?
It's a social and political construction.
Okay, so what does that mean? How is disability constructed?
How is it constructed? Like in the context of the pick or in the context
I'm
of
kind
your
of just asking
discourse
the
or just in
concept of
general?
what disability is. You've defended this concept. I'm asking about how this concept is constructed.
I don't think we define a totalizing frame of what it means. We just think that exclusion is bad. Like you have no offensive reason why the concept of mobility is good. And we won that the concept of mobility is exclusionary for some people. We don't need to win some totalizing theory about how disability.
Okay, sure.
works.
On the K, this geopolicing is a rhetorical argument, like private property is the root cause. Why does that matter?
It just bolsters our alternative, like our alt cause arguments.
Why is it an alt cause to the F?
If we win that capitalism is the root cause of the F, and the affirmative doesn't have a starting point of resisting capitalism, it's
The whole point of the app is to use physical spaces against these structures. Even if capitalism is the root cause, like why does that mean the app doesn't work? Even if we still resist the effects of
capitalist
that
property
system.
relations means that you don't get those spaces.
Okay, so it's just based on the idea that people can't actually have space.
Like,
sure, or the
Like capitalists will
concept of
never let us have it.
police is yes, that's the argument. It's an alternative cause argument.
Okay, sure. The presumption argument, why should we have to be held to the burden of spilling up?
Because then you have to prove why what you did was good. Otherwise, we just think that's our interpretation of doing the better debating.
otherwise, it means that your AF isn't inherent because,
Cool.
as
You've
you
made an
said, these
argument on
movements and
framework
spaces
that
already
debate is a
exist in the
game,
status
and
quo.
it's-
You don't
I have
contribute
more
anything to
questions.
them.
Sure.
You made an argument on framework that debate is kind of an insular game space. Why should we be forced to win a spill up argument if you've made that argument?
We will not be going for procedural fairness in the London R. You've considered thesequentiality. Griffin's going to kick that argument.
Speaking of which, the one in our is sent. It's just T. Let me know when everyone's got it and just good. Okay, cool. Somebody stop me if they're not ready. Great. Topicality, our interpretations that the affirmative must defend instrumental action of the United States federal government enacting substantial criminal justice reform in one or more of the three areas of the resolution: violation, they don't, insertion, endorsement of insurgent architecture completely separate from from the United States federal government or criminal justice reform. They say that it's a reform. No, it provides a challenge and an escape from the criminal justice system, but doesn't actually change the way that the carceral or the United States federal government operates, which means that they definitely don't meet our violation. The internal link to our impact is predictable. Limits 2 warrants first predictability of their picking and choosing which parts of the resolution to defend justifies any interpretation because there are infinite prior ethical questions to the resolution and allows NEF to be reasonably topical by picking the most limiting term that includes them, i.e., they talk about the criminal justice system. Therefore, their resolution. So, the second one is predictability under their model. They had infinite access to an already massive topic lesson to pick out of any method or actor and spike out of functional limits like the politics, it said, courts and executive counterplates and critiques of the current carceral state, which is the only stable negative ground on this topic. They say the functional limits will be able to check no functional law requires having carded evidence about why the app would necessarily be a bad idea, which we can't get to if the app isn't predictable, because there's no way we'd have known to research these things pre-tournament, and pre-tournament prep doesn't solve it because there are hundreds of teams at each tournament and we can't prep case next to every single app. It's just completely unreasonable to assume we would be able to do so, and the impact is clash is unreasonable, is intrinsic to any reason debate is valuable, and our model facilitates uniquely in-depth and analytical clash. They say it's inevitable, but it's a sliding scale. It's a question of how much clash is able to be had and what kinds of clash are able to have. Our model produces better clash as for warrants. First is CJR. Developing a nuanced understanding of the legal carceral system is key to dismantling. That's proven by Peter Loach using his debate knowledge to help abolish the death penalty in New Mexico. Second is dogma. In-depth debates means challenging hegemonic claims like the absence of the possibility of clash debates becomes polarized and static, which hurts our ability to convince others outside of debate. Third is research. Only our model facilitates third and fourth level research because lip races and predictability. Debate shouldn't be about the objective correctness of arguments, but our ability to research and defend them. Fourth is that a turns case. All their evidence indicates that the state is the one who controls space and does atmospheric management in the status quo, which means that they can't solve absent state engagement. Also prevents positive subject formation because negatives have the default to framework, hedge, and stay good to be able to answer you because they have no prep, which means they can't engage in the kind of counter method debates that they say are key to solving the and T outweighs cases. A procedural question of whether or not the debate should have happened in the first place. A case versus the ballot isn't key to any other offense. Say the interruption is able to create subject formation. No non-normative fiat will definitely be able to solve this, but I get to that more on the TVA. If they win this argument, it definitely bolsters the disad on the pick because it means that subject formation does happen through discursive speech acts like debate, and that their discursive speech acts should be rejected on face their counter model. It still links to all of our offensive resolutions. The only stable stasis going forward debate is also incredibly unpredictable and still links to our clash offense independently and justifies acts about prison riots, anarchist collective formation, and narrative about shooting counts, all of which have no predictable negative ground and no way to engage. They're not going for their standards. There's no cross application here, which is they can't leverage this turn against class. They've considered the thesis of conditionality that was crossed at the TVA. They could have used their literature to justify the USFG ending forensic science policing and sentencing would be a good idea. Any solvency deficits prove that there's negative ground, which is an advantage to our model. They could have read their performativity stuff as a disadd to the TVA, which proves that there would be negative clash. And also, you can read our affirmative, which forms abolitionist pedagogies within debate through speech acts, which we say spills up to the USFG doing abolition as our telos, as the telos of our politics. They could do this with an analysis of atmospheric management done by police and be able to solve it through a topical plan to the architectural disad. It just says that destroying carcerality is necessary, which the TVA would definitely be able to solve because our interpretation isn't that reform excludes abolition, which means they could have written abolition app, which solves this. The young piece of evidence is also wrong. It says that we can, it's wrong, and the TVA definitely solves it because we can still discuss carceral atmosphere and subject formation under our model as for the TVA that I explained above. It means that we solve all of their offense and any risk of an impact is an easy negative ballot. If solvency is somehow dependent on other people researching the ads and reading on the negative, definitely solves their offense. I didn't get a I really didn't get a clear answer here, so I really didn't get a clear answer here, so I don't know what they're going to respond with the 1AR with. Switching sides is necessarily good. That's victory beast. Well, one of the most transformative learning experiences adopting diametrically opposed positions to departure from orthodox practices enables debaters to rely on conventional wisdom, but the use of difficult research and critical thinking to defend it with their own beliefs seems to be one of the useful virtues that debate provides. Debating purposes can and should even happen in a traditional framework. Topicality is not a double term with the rest of the block framework. Isn't policing at all. We're joined here in the form of testing the app in multiple angles is good, which is why we're not going for the fairness stuff. And reading the app in debate forces us to say that it's bad for some reason. The valid criticism that is outside of the bound of resolution that their model creates bad debates. At worst, are extra topical. Criminal justice is incredibly massive in the resolution. It limits us to only 3 areas. It's just by adding infinite more areas because they include changing prisons architecturally, which the Serrano piece of evidence, all of our definitions include at least to our limits explosion often because they arbitrarily allow the act to do anything tangentially related to criminal justice because prison reform and architecture reform are entirely different topics and don't link to anything like federalism, courts, or the crime disad, which means that they lose.
Okay, we had, let's see, 6:33. I'll start up. Okay, we have 143. I'm not reading any cards. The order is going to be case, T, the pick.
Can you mute Narcol?
Okay, is anybody not ready to start? Okay, unless somebody says something like the next 10 seconds, I'm gonna start. Atmospheres are neutrality inform affective relationships and understanding of space results as reactive synchronization put the others in the zones of livability which reifies racial atmospheres that result in the obliteration of past life which sustains a white monopoly and violence. Absence of architecture that states population control enables self-determined relationships in space for survival, incubation of broader resistance, rupture of dominant atmospheres. The lie they say the presumption there's a double standard that you wouldn't expect a policy director before the act, which means that you shouldn't perform it either. We think that creating reading this around does have implications, but that is not the basis of our solvency. If we have a defended increase in the status quo, they get any disaster that, which means that none of their offense applies. And the co-option argument, we are creating US church by repurposing things that already exist, which means that also doesn't apply. That concludes that police crackdown is offensive. That's the status quo. Police are already doing that in status quo, but insurgent architecture allows people to fly under the radar, create zones for organizing, which was also the co-option to that. You can hospital that from the CAPK answers this argument that say at least the anarchy, no, it's still organized in groups, which means that that's not the same thing. The after stuff doesn't apply. We didn't just say after. We also includes material conditions. We think materiality is good. Just proves a pick is bad because they focus on those justifications. T. The counter-interpretation solves the action defended method for substantially disrupting the criminal justice system in the United States. It causes better resolution of discussions. Its core office like cycle abolition movements is that the right color crimes pick all lose the matching errors like Concon or politics which aren't about the topic, and it obviously substantially limits out all of the examples of the from the one another for why the act under limits the practice. They didn't answer. It forces you, so we can't force you that finish action. So we don't have our hands on the levers of power. But debating micropolitical driven strategy through K debates means that it becomes possible to understand the operation and no possibilities for interruption of criminal justice as we learn different methods that we can individually pursue. That's it's not just about discussing the localism. Decide that training criminal justice as top-down use approach is incorrect, which answers all of the prison distinction. There is no distinction. That's the young evidence. Instead, as produced in individual local atmospheres or carcerality construction constantly changing understandings of space to mobilize different forms of exclusion. They can't explain why cops be racial as virulence at different protests means they've misdiagnosed how the topic works. And we should that the state and the TV definitely doesn't solve that. Such information outweighs. Yes, debate isn't just the birth of the flow after 2 years. Community. We all agree soon debate is worse since we lack community practices, but the model says 90 minutes around outweighs 90% of our time. How we design debate matters if there's no point to that. They build a space in non-order field doesn't solve any of those systems because we have a sense of the formal reading framework that security does not all extended at the top. That's our to be framework is debate's response to itself, which chaos are seen as the hegemonic match of values of debates and policy debaters enforce an arbitrary values space, but the space is a real sense case space here to say there's also navigating it's just based on the false reading of what debate looks like. It means they can't get out of anything so too busy. It wasn't wishing like this. They say predictably security does that impact towards the way we think about what's predictable. Predictability is a real debate's always changing. Differs geographically between ideologies, which means their assertion of predictability is intellectual elitism. The limits of not impacted and self-underloading is inevitable. Policy teams runs in the margin with apps like Coast Guard, Cloud, or Guantanamo. No reason why ours is worse. Their clash is worth topic agnostic generics like Concon clash with AF content, random procedures across questions, which is worthless. Cross-complaint practical so decided our bottom centralized KDK clash is better since it can be actualized. They didn't answer that. It doesn't solve policy teams to break new apps and obfuscate the catch opponents off guard. Localism disapproves the content of our teacher discussion is proven by how the one and our agrees that education and research is what of what we get out of debate is important in the TVA. It doesn't solve our form-based offense about reading framework. Also doesn't solve the app. It's not just about saying atmospheres. It's about discussing persistence and strategies. And we said that micro level resistance is bad. That's the practice. Yeah, for form doesn't do anything but humanize the system. Mwani says they also repurpose violence instead of changing it. Switch side debate doesn't solve. We couldn't just read the Africans as one. Is he against both sides? They proves they crowd us out. There's no explanation whatever of what the app looks like. Okay, it's a double standard policy. Debaters can read arguments on both sides, but K debaters have to switch sides. And it's just not just about the style of the argument to read. Cross-policy security decide here. And switch side paradox means they should have been ready if we could have read it on the negative. The permutation to insertion architecture is a way to counteract ableism. They didn't answer it. We think that they basically theorized how ableism functions. I think that it's a purely social construct based on discourse, but the whole point of the app is that the way we understand the self through atmospheres, which are not just mental, that's the role of the Mwani evidence. The impact was explained on case ableism is comprised of all things like medical testing, which is not just physical, it's offense, since they mythologize a specific idea of disability that is entirely disconnected from physical conditions, which is indirect and apologist lived experience. It means the pig doesn't solve for the app since they understand identity through language, but we understand it through atmospheres. Their theory is homogenizing because it assumes a universal frame of what disability is. I not being mobile, which instructs a specific image of disability who has choose people who don't want to fit that image, i.e. mobile disabled folks or things like mental disabilities. Even so, all extent picks bad. Their answers are pretty bad. Their process is bad. You can classify this in the cat pig. Leptospirity politics is bad. I think it's that anyone from the affidavit to reject all of that's a bad idea and leads to less movement success. Overall picks are an issue. You should vote them down. First, the ground they steal 99% of the absence. They only pick out of time part, which forces to restart the span and suicide. This is literally the most regressive form of war pig because they haven't said that insurgent architectures themselves are bad. It's just proven by how the pig on the highlighted lines out of our evidence. None of our evidence says that it's only about mobility as a metaphor. We haven't metaphorized anything. All of their proclaims are about things like space monopolization, which is our global movement to combat the global movement to push back against atmospheres, which means that it's not simply a metaphor. That is to enable sensibility operators of skirts of lever, but we are able to use the insurgent architectures as a way to do that, which means that permutation do both also solves the topic. And so the second reason pigs are voting issues that topic education, they decentered methods made focus on the method and discussing favor discussing minor distinctions. It ensures that we can never clash with that or engage in core controversies, and it's infinitely aggressive. They can pick out of any of the two of the 24,000 words that we see, which gives them unloaded ground since we can't predict or clash against that, which means that they yeah, that's unpredictable.
Okay. We have 4:45. Let me do this. Starting now. Okay. Everyone seems to be here. Is everyone good for an order? Topicality, the pick argument, the case page. Everyone good? Cool. Topicality, we're not going for consider the way they can see the discussionality king or trip the king over T is offense. The two are 5 reasons. First, the pick result in back turns gives a reason with the criticism. Second, if we win, they said that if we win a brick counter method, we should win the debate. Third, if the 1 air says we get their model would limit a certain absolute also. Fourth, the true articulation to the distance and TOD unpredictable. They've conceded too much. They do not allow the true art to moralizing diatribe. If you can't charge direct line for the two, so then when I the true art striking at low fifth, then there's no back now between the net benefit and the picks the pick page proper undercovering framework of it allows the true that makes the true art unfeasible. True reason. First, there was no offensive reason for why a central tenet of the one you see is good. Second, they had no impact analysis between any of their turns and the picks. So we had mobility as a metaphor is bad. Metaphors of mobility are according to these and solves the one to see. That's their material evidence. Which their solvency advocate. And then the quotes of the two and see explain how they actively trivialize the lived experiences of people with disability and make it into a fungible object to theorize rather than the material lives of the people with disabilities. Like their metaphor of the mobility of the mind is independently ableist because it adheres to normative conception and cognitive functioning with answers no essential arguments. The main theory outlining this metaphor is a violent exclusionary practice that not devalues people with disability, which is independent impact, but also turns cases that precludes people with disabilities from participating in their alternative spaces, which turns the entire the advocate precludes movement building and independently leaves people behind and dominated by state authority, which movement turns out. Thus, we endorse the affirmative minus the metaphorical use of the term mobility. There's no offensive reason why they couldn't use terms like transformation. At the very, very worst, they've considered the exceptionality. So if the pick doesn't solve, and it's rejected, or they when it reasons the judge can get and vote on the net benefit. The first argument of the permutation, they drop the framework interpretation of the 1AC, the 1AC optional research, and we should only get the F by testing those educations because those are the reasons to give an F, which means you're fundamentally critical, and it's key to ensure that it is considered dedicated error replication because it's sure the harms of the rhetoric because the way their architecture spill up isn't inherently ableist, which means that we have to mitigate the F, and it's the best way to negate truism. I was like this one, that's the permutation. That means that ideological severance. You can't permute a pick. Obviously, it would be severance, and it's just magnetic ground, which is a voting for fairness argument responsibility, which they've considered that the framework is good. The next argument, the affirmative being good, it doesn't matter in the abstract about your affirmative being good for certain types of people because the picker agrees with their theory of atmospheric. It's just a counter method, which they said was a burden of the F, and it just says we should do the affirmatively, which is a whole framing argument for all of their picks. Bad argument because you shouldn't even interpret it as a pick in the first place. It's just a counter method to the 1AC, which is fundamentally competitive, and so all their elements. Specific idea of disability offense. No, we refuse to define one in classics, and they just uttered the word atmospheric was good, so they did the impact analysis. Next, trying to go for this argument in the first place. Also, the advocacy fundamentally solves because it doesn't ascribe to theorists. It just said that their form of exclusion and subscribing to certain form of ability is bad. We don't define them in any exclusionary way, and we just the affirmative exclusion is bad. The last argument about picks being fundamentally that counter-interpretation, we get to picks. I don't know what I say. They dropped that it's not doesn't like to any of the offense because they misunderstood our term because we should be able to pick out of central tenets of the 1AC, like their advocacy and their solvency advocate, which we both specific quotes from the 2NC, and they fundamentally mishandle, which Griffin was sent out in an evidence document after on. It solves all their offense because it excludes random word picks and only has test per staff that they center their core parts of the offense. As for the quotes, which is that it's fundamentally their term is fundamentally aggressive because it includes anything that links just like spiking any disad because they just sever out of it in the first place. We should be able to force to say that we should not be forced to say geopolicing or control space are good. Our term feels like a nuanced forms of class with answers to topic education, like the negative degree of the ask method solvency advocates, which was a nuanced forms of in-depth activities or critical between critical teams over unique forms of education, which are only accessible under our model. They could drop that reps or matter. So even if they win these technical arguments, but fairness, the spill argument, the example of both David Duke and liberals both wanting to support arms to Israel, one because of any something else it means we control the implementation, and the affirmative implementation fundamentally goes failure to zero policy failure, which they impact turn to all of their arguments. They also agree that rhetoric matters as per their 1AC. It's the only way their pedagogy spills up. So at worst, the pick is just that this adds to the affirmative. The fundamentally always all their offense. The steals 90% of the F. You picked and shows everything in the 1AC. The regressive argument's not that the topic education reacts as a better mode of education. As for at the bottom, the best argument for why picks are good is just method testing, which they conceded that it's just a counter advocacy to the F, and there's no distinction between us and their counter C, which was a unique form of education, and they're two behind this may go to the case page. They're that they dropped 2 speeches in a row that their theory of affect atmosphere is wrong. When is Martin says the question of social and constitutive factors, like the way that we speak and debate, which leads you to reject them over the essential in the one you see. And it really means that going for the perm, the pick means they can't solve because they know the way atmosphere is starting through language. The Rosberg evidence that their use of affect is no pure value outside of its relationship with the political, which means that even if the theory of affect is true, they haven't explained the way it translates into material action. We don't make negation impossible. And so it's fundamentally fair on the ground because the central tenet of the one you see, they're true behind every part of the debate. So you must go negative.
143 start. Order is case in the pick. If anyone's not good, let me know. Awesome. This is a really easy app. When the Turner has tried to go for an argument that the way we understand identity is purely through linguistics, but the core thesis claim of the 1AC is that the way emotion and understanding of the world is constructed is through the physicality of space, which means that functionally the pig is not able to solve very much of the app, which I will impact in a minute, but they've conceded a couple of arguments, criminal justice is carceral space making, i.e. the atmosphere is a position overcoat, the way that we understand the space, the physical construction is like where cops position their bodies to inform the way that we think about who belongs to those spaces, but in terms of architecture, a key counter method to solve by repurposing and building up architectural spaces. It's an act against the state's population control. We can do things like enable disorderly bodies to self-determine their own relationships. That's key to survival strategies because otherwise the state will always engage in this cycle of racial violence against them. It's also a way to incubate other broader resistance mechanisms, which is the only way to spill it by discussing their methods. Their affect bad stuff is definitely a reason why the PIC doesn't solve anything, but it's not a risk of a reason why the app doesn't solve anything. IBF said that an affect focus specifically is bad. The entirety of the 1AC reasons why physicality is bad, i.e. atmospheres is a combination of affect theory with a bunch of other theories about things like critical geographies, which is that it's not just about the way we think, it's about the way that spaces intersect with the way that our bodies move through them and the way they inform how we think, which means that we haven't just said affect, so that doesn't apply, but it does definitely apply to the P because they've said that only discourse informs the way that we understand the rule, which we have impact from going to the pick. Look at the top of the pick. I'm sorry, they've just conceded a permutation, which was permutation due the permutation certain architectures as a way to resist ableism. This dovetails really well with the entirety of the 1AC because we have impact term, the way that they think about disability and the way that we construct our co-identities. They have said that it's purely a social construct based on discourse, but the whole point of the app is that we understand the self through atmospheres, which are not just mental. I want you to read the role and Manawi card because they're only cards that talk about the way that we interpret our conception of the self and the other, and it says that atmospheres are central to those, which means it's not just about the words we say or the things that we think. It's about physicality. Disability is also constructed by the fact that some people have different physical attributes or that some spaces are geographically inaccessible to disabled folks, which means that theorizing affiliated the idea of linguistics is always going to miss the boat on the way that disability operates, this is definitely offense against him because this is offense against him because it means that they misaddress the way that disability functions within the rule, which means that if we want our counter theorization of how it operates is correct, it's definitely a reason why you should definitely air out because the entirety of the 2 is then negative for them because it's reasons why they are wrong. But their theory of linguistics definitely cannot solve any of our theory, i.e. the point of the 1EC is that physicality and materiality is important, which means that they can't just pick and choose and say, no, we have a theory of linguistics. Linguistics are the explanation of the rule, but we'll steal all of your stuff about physicality because those are fundamentally contradictory options. Definitely means that there's no way for them to solve any of the impacts of the 1EC, which means that all of it's about survival strategies, resistance methods, because considered architectures outweigh any risk of the net benefit, any risk of the net benefit they've gone for here. But the permutation definitely solved. The permutation is an argument about practice, i.e. the way that we can mold and search architectures to combat the way that ableism plays out in the world. It's not necessarily just a permutation of the word pick argument that they've gone for, but it's a permutation of their literature base that says that we should think about physicality not purely through sociality, but through atmospheres, which is important because it's the best way to actually counter the physical way that atmospheres play themselves out, which I identified as bad. Even still, they don't have a great link to why the app is a bad idea because it's not a core thesis of the 1EC. The way we describe mobility is not about people's bodies moving from place to place. It's about the idea that the state tries to maintain a spatial monopoly on what space is and who is able to inhabit it. Mobility is just the idea of not letting them do that. It's not just about the movement within space. It definitely means there's not really a risk of a link. Look at the picks bad argument. It still applies. The whole point is they have not disproven a central tenet of the app. All of their rants about how they don't allow word picks are definitely wrong because they picked and choose a word that's in one of our cars. It means they don't meet their interp. If we said that we infer social architecture as a method of transformation, that would have no implication for the telos of what the app actually does because it is a misrepresentation of what our literature says. Proof this pick is the worst and most infinitely regressive version of a word pick. We agree that reps are a thing, but our method are valuable to discuss when they're actually a counter method, which the argument is on. It's not a counter method. It's we will steal your method and prune out little parts of that we don't like. They terminally decimate movements, which means that I'm gonna go for the practice here because they've conceded it's definitely offense against it because they are the exact form of leftist purity politics. We were always hyper policing the words of the other, which means we can never spell it to any form of action. They've conceded the young card on the framework page, which means that our discussions are able to spell it, but only if we can discuss the costs and benefits of doing certain things, because there's no way they're ever able to spell it. Picks are actively a voting issue for this because it means that there's no way for them to actualize their politics. It means that they're stuck in the echo chamber of debate, but only the apps method is able to ever actualize anything. But they're definitely a voter. They steal 99% of the app. They'll pair a tiny power forces to restart the debate in the 2AC, which is the proven by how they just pick unhighlighted lines out of our evidence, say, oh, look, any of the 20,000 words in the 1AC is, but it actively crowds out KVK discussions, which we have set on the framework page already good, which means that this is a residual offense against this. The offense against them. You can crossplay all that stuff from the 1AR. Look, the central question of this debate is that nobility is not a metaphor. It's about movements. We haven't said that it's a metaphor for that, but it's about the way that the carceral state tries to impose a spatial monopoly on the way that violence operates. We've said mobility is a way to resist that thing. It's not just about the actual movement into a new space.
Good round. The negative evidence document is sent.
All sent throughout. All sent to AppDoc.
Yeah, and Ian, can you in the AppDoc will you try to make a note or flag the cards from that draw this distinction between linguistics or discourse and materiality?
the F card doc should be sent.
10-minute warning for the decision deadline. 10 minutes. Thank you. 5-minute warning for decision time. 5 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Is everybody here? Okay. Congrats both teams on a phenomenal elimination run. The decision was a 3-0 for the negative from GBS. I was last, so I can go in unless somebody else desperately wants to. Go to negative to endorse the 1AC minus the term and frame of mobility. Thought the neg one that using mobility as a descriptor for liberatory politics is what their 2NC Tchaikovsky evidence would characterize as an interpretive act. It frames our thinking unconsciously in a manner that comports with ableist notions of value and establishes a paradigm that's less capable of valuing disabled individuals. Moving is liberation. It's something that only able-bodied people have access to, and so unthinkingly reasserting it into our method of thinking is likely to poison our embedded relationalities. The neg completely agrees with the AF on the importance of language as a world-making device, and their 1C evidence really couldn't have been any more pertinent. It says, quote, "We question the use of ableist notions of mobility and movement to define and imagine liberation, resistance, and transformation." So like the 1AC's advocacy text, like, or the line that's at least the very closest to one, is, quote, "The AF endorses insurgent architectures as a form of mobility against the spatial control of criminal justice." The card that was referred to as a solvency advocate, to which that's a tag, describes its method as, quote, "I will articulate mobility as a disruption to the nation state's colonial, racial, ethnic identity population control." It's like kind of hard to square this with the rest of the AF speech, which I think tries to like dismiss this as a random word pick when it really, I can't actually imagine how it could be any more essential to how the 1AC was constructed. Like literally, I don't even know what that would be. And so the solvency deficits to me don't really follow. Like the initial one on the case about affect bad means the pick can't solve. I mean, this evidence about mobility doesn't actually use the word affect once, which is kind of like a weird disconnect between that and the rest of the 1AC. And it actually kind of seems to demonstrate the point that one need not use mobility in order to explain or, in a metaphorical sense, depict affective or embodied relations. The top of the 2ER about emotion overcoding and transcending physical space is similarly a reason that we don't need to be literal. We don't need to be mobile. We don't need to use movement. We can actually talk about overcoding and transcending. Practice DA, similar line of logic. Purity policing is a new articulation in the 2ER and one that's, you know, again, kind of wrong for the same reason that you don't win the link to pick SPAG, which is that this is not a tiny, you know, micro policing or, you know, quibble with semantics. In as much as one can have a method debate against a KF, it's harder to see what's closer to one. They do have an interpretation that basically solves your offense. I will say it's a little annoying because I didn't catch the exact text of it, and it felt like I morphed a little bit between the 2NC and 2NR. I don't know if it was we can only have one from your solvency advocate, we can only have your solvency method, or we can only have something that's like literally in the plan. Whichever it is, it meets all of those, and it's not clear. There's no like arbitrariness argument that kind of applies to their counter interpretation. Like this isn't even really a word pick. I almost think that NEG maybe does themselves a disservice by calling it as much, because while the whole point is that it's not a word pick, the difference between transformation and mobility might seem minute, but in a debate where the AF has made it, basically all about affective architectures, this would seem to be elevated to the level of real importance. The one piece of advice I would maybe have to the AF for dealing with this would be just like, you should kind of do the opposite of what you do and say that, or not to do the opposite, but maybe kind of go a little bit further and say movement is not a metaphor. Movement is something that everybody does. If you are capable of thought, which is, the classic Badiou definition of a human agent, that's like written kind of to avoid ableist criticism. It's kind of the point of it. If you're capable of thought, you're capable of moving, because that's the definition of thought. You move from one place to the next, and you don't even have to physically move at all. And so if conscious thought entails movement, then maybe this mobility frame is a little bit overboard. And to be honest, pretty much every verb that connotes action, which is used all the time everywhere throughout speech, in some ways can be construed as ableist, because like when you say that something desirable in some way, produces, are you saying that those who are incapable of producing, fail? If I say the word refer, is the fact that somebody who can't speak, they can't refer to anything, does that make the word refer ableist? And I think you should say, like, that's kind of the beauty of language. It is a world-making device. It does shape the world, but we need to kind of orient like what we're saying, and not just how we're saying it. And so if you can like diminish the link to something that makes it seem way more about how it's saying and not what, if you control F-C and stuff like that in all of their speech docs, I bet it comes up. And they basically like called you, I don't know if they use the word like stupid, but they said like something you did was like vacuous or idiotic or some point. Definitely point that out. Like, I feel like definitely even with like minimal additional real arguments could have been an okay place, but to be honest, it was tough to see what the after was by the end of this one.
I disagree. I agree. I don't disagree. I agree with everything that Kevin said, and I'll try not to repeat too many things for you all. So yeah, I voted negative because the pick solves the AF. It has a net benefit that's not really addressed. I'll just quickly talk about how I thought about the links perm theory and then that materiality argument that I thought the 2AR was kind of going for. Yes, there's a link. Kevin already talked about that. Mobility as disruption, mobility as opinion, mobility as civics, the evidence even says, which I thought the negative could have done a little bit better job being like, that's where the metaphor gets kind of stressful. In addition to all the things Kevin said about literal movement, the AF doesn't have a defense of mobility as the metaphor for the solvency of the AF. So you got to come up with one of those. I do think the affirmative is winning that atmospheres and affect matter, and that's all tied up with materiality. I think you're doing a really beautiful job talking about those things, and your evidence is really good. But the pick would solve all of that because it's all the AF minus metaphor if you don't have a defense of the metaphor. So that's like the real downside of something that's kind of like a word pick or a method pick or however we're going to call it. I appreciate the confidence with which the 2AR extends the perm, but I don't think that the 2AR responded to the arguments about severance and argumentative responsibility that the 2NR made. So it's kind of like, that was a good like ethos-y type moment of the 2AR, but then once I looked back at the 2NR, I was like, no, there are definitely arguments here that I think are pretty good. So that left theory and this materiality thing. In terms of theory, the only thing that I'll add to what Kevin said is that I thought their interpretation was clear in the 2NC and the 2NR, and it's just that they only get picks out of things in the solvency advocate, which is very predictable. It's like one of the most important parts of the AF, and you should know inside, outside, backwards, whatever, and be able to defend it. So I think that solves a lot of your offense. And I also think that they solve the KVK stuff really well. They've made a good argument about why having what seems like nitpicky arguments are actually like really nuanced and in-depth produces really good KVK debates, which is an argument I've never in my life been persuaded by until today. So GBS, killing it. Yeah. And then the last thing is, I think in the 2AR, you're really trying to make this distinction between like discourse and materiality, and they think it's all about discourse, but the app is about materiality. And I understand like the urge to do so, but I think it's an artificial distinction. All of your evidence talks about how discourse, aesthetics, materiality, all those things come together, affect to create atmosphere. So it's sort of like, it's all of those things. And I don't think the negative ever once said it's only discourse, but that discourse has a relationship to like the material experiences of disabled people, which I think they're correct about. The last thing I'll say is, it's possible the other two judges kind of like this as like a critique of the metaphor or like a method thing or whatever, but I kind of thought, I like the simplicity of it as a word pick is something else to think about, which is just like, if you win theory and you've got a good card about it, it's just like a technically simple debate to evaluate, which is like, I'm not asking you to like cater to me per se, but I'm just saying for a lot of judges, just the like formula of that is kind of simple and straightforward. So I think there is some utility to doing that in the 2NR.
It's really quick though. I agree. I liked it a lot. I would just maybe phrase it as a method pick, as like literally the same argument, but completely agree with like the simplicity and elegance of the setup. And the only thing I meant with theory is because I didn't mean to say it was like super unclear. I just think if you meant like the solvency advocate, like for what the app has to do, or like the card itself. Like for example, one part of the card says in a random and underlined part, in the early 1900s, there was a dispossession in Armenia. Can I pick out of that and be like, no, that wasn't a dispossession, that was the Armenian genocide? That's in the solvency advocate card. That's all I meant by the interpretation. Wasn't like super clear to me. But you know, after you got to point that kind of stuff out and use those examples to like set up the theory arcs. Sorry.
Yeah, so I won't, or do you all hear me? Okay, cool. Just making sure. Yeah, so I won't go super long. I wrote a whole like book or whatever that I put in the RFD that you can read. But yeah, I mostly agree with everything. I think that the minute risk that because the neg thinks about discourse as creating reality, that maybe they don't solve the AF. I don't think that outweighs the risk of exclusion of people with disabilities. I think that, you know, the biggest thing that I'll probably sit on is just this atmospheres are material, not just discursive stuff, just to show how I kind of view that. First, I think that just because discourse is not the only thing that influences material reality, it doesn't mean that the AF's discursive construction of mobility doesn't have implications, and that those implications can't be tracked. You could, you know, maybe win this theory, but I'd still probably be inclined to vote neg, because I believe that the material construction of disability is probably related to the materiality of knowledge production, because A, what other internal link would the AF have to affect besides speaking? B, it seems in line with your Mwani evidence where it talks about how racial meaning is produced. There's no real, I think that the AF would benefit from like any evidence about disability, maybe evidence about why like linguistic approaches themselves, you know, trade off with materiality or are bad, or just, you know, definitions about how they overdetermine it. Perhaps like, so for these sort of overdetermination arguments, I really don't understand why the neg has a homogenized understanding of disability, or if they do, what the impact that is. You know, maybe a way of thinking about this that I don't think completely resolves the link, but like is maybe some defense or something, is like, you know, mobility in a certain context can also be a disability, i.e. the inability to restrain oneself in a certain context means that, you know, people who are prone to particular forms of, you know, tremors or forms of, you know, bodily movement that they can't control might understand the relationship that the neg's understanding of disability is maybe differently. But, you know, I think the broader thing that the AF needs to do is to actually, you know, ask the question of like why the 1AC evidence kind of like uses the language of mobility. And it's because they're talking about like geographical control and the movement and like the kind of, you know, spatial control of population. So I think that you should talk about how like mobility in that context also could be the capacity to be moved, not to move oneself, which might, you know, at least create some possible distinctions. That combined with just like a broader, earlier focus on why, you know, discourse is bad.